As the German-Italian Panzer Army prepared to meet the coming British offensive at El Alamein, the tide of battle in the central Mediterranean was at last beginning to turn. Throughout the first half of 1942, the island of Malta had been brought almost to its knees by a combination of air raids and attacks on convoys bringing essential supplies. In August, the Pedestal convoy, the most heavily protected merchant convoy ever to sail, ran the gauntlet between Gibraltar and Valletta. Of the 14 merchant ships that set out, only 5 reached the Maltese port, but the supplies they carried were sufficient to maintain Malta in the fight. In October, the air attacks increased in intensity in a last desperate attempt to bludgeon the island into submission. But again the offensive failed, and after 8 days of savage fighting, the Axis daylight raiders were driven off. The survival of Malta as a strategic air and naval base astride the main Axis lines of communication would ensure that the Panzer Army continued to suffer the chronic shortages that had blunted its drive through Egypt and brought it to a halt at Alamein in the summer. On the eve of the Battle of Alamein, the Panzer Army suffered from several disadvantages. Among them, the absence of its long-serving and highly respected commander, and its pronounced material inferiority in men, equipment and supplies. But these were compounded by a complete lack of reliable intelligence. No one knew when or where the British offensive would open. Senior Axis commanders could do little but attend to their own sectors and hope that the blow, when it came, could be contained. On the British side, intelligence appreciations gave an accurate picture of their enemy's strength and general deployment, but only a rough indication of the depth of the Axis defenses. If these survived the initial assault, the offensive would have to be reinforced or even remounted with fresh troops in a different sector. In its final deployment, 8th Army consisted of 3 corps. The strongest of these, the 30th Corps, was commanded by Lieutenant General Oliver Lees. 30 Corps consisted of 5 infantry divisions and 1 armoured brigade group. The composition of 30 Corps, which included divisions from Australia, New Zealand, India and South Africa, reflected the commitment of the British Empire and Commonwealth to the battle. The southern sector of the line would be held by 13th Corps. This was commanded by Lieutenant General Brian Horrocks. 13 Corps consisted of 3 divisions, of which 2 were infantry and 1 armoured. 13 Corps would mount diversionary attacks in support of 30 Corps' main offensive in the north. 10th Corps comprised the reserve and consisted of 2 armoured divisions under the command of Lieutenant General Herbert Lumsden. 10 Corps' task was to exploit the breaches torn in the enemy's front by 8th Army's infantry. Air support would be provided by the Desert Air Force, commanded by Air Chief Marshal Sir Arthur Tedder. Tedder's squadrons would be required both to protect and support 8th Army in its efforts. Facing these forces, the Panzer Army was commanded, in Rommel's absence, by General George Stummer and consisted of 3 Italian and 1 German corps. The Italian 21st Corps was stationed in the northern sector and was commanded by General Ennio Navarini. 21st Corps consisted of 2 infantry divisions, both of which were deployed in depth behind extensive minefields and fortifications. The Italian 10th Corps, deployed in the south, also consisted of 2 infantry divisions. 10th Corps was commanded by General Eduardo Neber, who expected the main British attack to be launched in his sector of the front. The Italian 20th Corps, commanded by General Giuseppe de Stefanis, contained some of the best formations in the Italian army. 20th Corps consisted of 4 divisions, of which 3 were held in tactical reserve. The 2 armoured divisions close to the front, the motorised division further back. The Folgori Parachute Division was deployed on the extreme southern flank. The Panzer Army's main striking force, however, was the German Afrika Corps, consisting of 2 panzer divisions, 1 mechanized division and 1 infantry division. The Afrika Corps was commanded by General Wilhelm Ritter von Thoma. Von Thoma's infantry, along with detached elements of 15th Panzer and 1 brigade of paratroops, were defensively deployed, while the mobile components provided a tactical reserve. Air support for the Panzer Army would be provided by the 2nd Air Fleet based in Italy and commanded by Field Marshal Albert Kesselring. Kesselring's air fleet, however, had responsibility for the entire Mediterranean, and most of his resources would be devoted to keeping open the Panzer Army's lines of communication. When the 8th Army completed its final deployments on the eve of Alamein, it had already won the Battle of Supplies. It possessed a 2-to-1 material superiority in men, and in tanks, guns and aircraft the difference was even more pronounced. To a large extent, the unsung heroes of the conflict in North Africa were the officers and men of the Royal Navy, and the soldiers, civilians and airmen on Malta. By their efforts in the central Mediterranean, they had rendered the Panzer Army virtually immobile and ensured that the coming British offensive would have the best possible chance of success. At precisely 9:40 p.m. on October the 23rd, 8th Army's artillery announced the beginning of the Battle of El Alamein. For 15 minutes, nearly 1,000 guns pounded the Axis rear areas. Then, after a slight pause for relaying, they began laying down a curtain of fire on the forward defences. As the barrage rolled gradually through the minefields, the infantry attack went in. The main attack was launched on a narrow frontage by 4 divisions: the 9th Australian, the 51st Highland, the 2nd New Zealand, and the 1st South African. Facing them, the Italian Trentino Division and the German 164th Division held strong defensive positions in the complex of fortifications and minefields that lay to the north and east of the Miteira Ridge. These forces were supported by the Italian Armoured Division, Littorio, and by 15th Panzer. Advancing behind the barrage, the British infantry and sappers quickly made good ground, cutting paths through the barbed wire and picking their way tentatively through the minefield. The first objective was a line drawn on the field maps halfway through the Axis defences and known as the Red Line. This was reached at around midnight in most sectors, and then there was a short pause while the front was consolidated, companies regrouped, and second-wave battalions came up to take over the lead. While this was being carried out, the artillery barrage fell on the Axis positions to the west and southwest, rolling forward from the Red Line to the night's final objective, the Oxalic Line. This ran along the far side of the Materia Ridge and then swung north towards the coast. In the remaining hours of darkness, the infantry advanced towards these objectives, while the sappers cleared 2 corridors through the minefields behind them. As the night progressed, however, and the German-Italian defenders recovered from their shock, the attack began to lose momentum, and daybreak found the British holding positions in most sectors slightly short of the Oxalic Line. On the 24th, the British made several attempts to pass their armour through the minefield corridors to the Oxalic Line, but all were frustrated, either by uncleared mines or by highly accurate German anti-tank fire. This was a serious setback, indicating that the German defences were much deeper than the British had anticipated. The same fate, for much the same reasons, befell the diversionary attacks launched by Horrocks' corps in the south. But these operations, despite the high cost in casualties, achieved their primary objectives, engaging 21st Panzer and holding it in the southern sector. On the Axis side, the situation, though serious, was not yet desperate. The chaos and disorganization that had followed the opening barrage was gradually being brought under control. General Stummer had been killed in the first few hours of the attack, and von Thoma had taken temporary command until Rommel could reach the front. Despite heavy casualties, the front had held, and the main Axis gun line still remained intact, safely west of the Oxalic Line. For the remainder of that day, and most of the next, the fighting raged incessantly. On the 26th, Rommel transferred 21st Panzer from the south to buttress the defences in the northern sector. By now, the main thrust of the British attack had become obvious. The weight of shell fire alone betrayed their plans. But the redeployment of Axis armour west of the Oxalic Line threatened to block this thrust, or at the very least, seriously disrupt Montgomery's timetable. Over the next few days, there was particularly heavy fighting in this sector. On the 27th, 21st Panzer launched a counterattack north of the Materia Ridge, and 90th Light, brought up from reserve, attacked an Australian penetration towards the coast. Neither of these efforts were successful, but the violence of the assaults prompted Montgomery to reinforce Australian operations on the flank, in the hope of halting the build-up of Axis forces in the centre and draining Rommel's last reserves. By the end of October, the British had carved out a large salient, anchored in the south along the Materia Ridge and in the north on high ground known as Point 29. To prevent any further exploitation of the salient, Rommel had deployed all 4 German divisions in a line of containment, stretching from the ridge to the coast. On October the 28th, Australian infantry, supported by elements of the 10th Armoured Division, launched an attack from Point 29 towards the coast. The operation secured a wedge of territory about 1.5 miles long, from which further attacks were launched 2 days later. These operations gradually drew more and more German strength to the area. In particular, 21st Panzer was being slowly dismantled. Some units placed in reserve, others thrown into holding the coastal corridor. The southern sector of the line was now held almost entirely by Italian formations. Inside the salient, Montgomery had been busy reorganizing his forces. The New Zealand 2nd Division was redeployed across the rear of the 51st Highland to take up positions vacated by the Australians attacking to the north. Part of the 50th Division was sent forward to reinforce the Highlanders, and the South Africans took over the defence of the southern shoulder. On November the 2nd, after another heavy artillery barrage, the 3 divisions in the centre of the salient, supported by the 1st Armoured Division, together with parts of the 7th and 10th, attacked towards the flank of the German positions at their vulnerable junction with the Italians. By midday, the British had punched a hole in the Axis defences nearly 2 miles deep. Their leading infantry and tanks were engaging the last significant defences before the open desert, a screen of German anti-tank guns situated on high ground to the west. Behind the guns, what remained of the Axis armour was assembling in preparation for a counterattack. The attack was launched from the northwest against the tanks and guns of the 1st Armoured Division. Both sides suffered heavily, but Axis reserves were by now exhausted and losses were irreplaceable. By the end of the day, the Afrika Korps was reduced to 35 fit tanks. As yet, however, there was still no sign of a breakthrough. Repeated attacks by British armour and infantry continued to meet with fierce resistance. But the gradual process of attrition was taking its toll. The Axis front was now little more than a thin crust. Much of what remained of the Italian infantry had begun withdrawing on the 3rd, leaving only scattered rearguards to hold the line. In the centre and north, the front was held by Afrika Korps veterans, supported by the Italian Ariete Division. These forces, however, were exhausted, hungry, and short of ammunition. Efforts to fall back in stages had been frustrated by lack of transport and by remorseless British pressure. On November the 4th, von Thoma was captured, fighting alongside his men in the front line. Huge gaps were now being torn in the Axis defences, and further fighting had become futile. Late that afternoon, Rommel bowed to the inevitable and authorised a full-scale withdrawal. That night, under cover of darkness, the last remaining rearguards slipped away to the west, leaving the field of battle to their enemies. While the battered remnants of Rommel's panzer army struggled westwards, under almost incessant attack from the air, the second great blow to Axis power in the Mediterranean was about to be delivered. In the waters off Morocco and Algeria, the fleet task forces of Britain and America, consisting of some 400 ships and more than 100,000 men, were approaching the French-held coast. As darkness fell on October the 7th, the warships and transports moved up to their assembly areas a few miles offshore. Remarkably, the fleet had sailed from its various ports of embarkation without losing a single vessel, and as the assault troops began disembarking, there was every indication that the element of surprise remained complete. Certainly, some efforts had been made at the highest level to enlist French compliance, but as the assault boats moved to their jumping-off points, no one could be confident of their success. The most violent reaction came, as Allied planners had feared, from French naval units, who were known for their pro-Axis sympathies. In all three target sectors, coastal batteries engaged the invasion flotillas, and at Casablanca, these were joined by French naval guns, including those of the battleship Jean Bart, still under construction. RAF fighters and bombers were sent from Gibraltar to provide extra cover to the landings and to attack the French warships. By comparison, the resistance offered by French colonial garrisons was light, and in many instances merely token. On the landing beaches, the greatest hazard was the unpredictable tide and surf and the inexperience of the boat handlers. Over the course of the day, more landing craft would be lost through accidents, broachings and collisions than to enemy fire. Off Casablanca, the naval duel continued for several hours, and it was here also that the Allies encountered determined fighting on the ground. North of the town, the beaches were stoutly defended, and French aircraft made several strafing runs, adding to the casualties and compounding the confusion of the beachheads. Allied carrier-borne aircraft joined those flown in from Gibraltar, gradually chasing the inferior French machines from the landing areas. By noon, most of the seaworthy French warships had been sunk or disabled, and the guns of the immobile Jean Bart had been put out of action by a well-aimed salvo from the American battleship Massachusetts. French aircraft still appeared intermittently in the area, but as yet, no task force vessel had sustained significant damage. Of the three French ports strategically targeted for early seizure, Algiers proved the easiest and was captured with its harbour facilities intact on the first day. The port of Oran, however, proved more difficult, partly due to the failure of two key components of the plan. The main Allied landings took place on the flanks, in comparatively quiet coastal sectors east and west of Oran. These were largely unopposed, and beachheads were soon established. But a raiding party, in two light vessels, was sent in to secure the town's harbour complex by a surprise frontal assault. These were engaged by shore batteries and by French warships in port, and both vessels were quickly destroyed. A further component of the plan called for the quick capture of two airfields, situated to the southeast of the town. These were to be taken by airborne forces flown from England, But the long distances involved, combined with bad weather and poor organization, resulted in most of this force landing on the dry bed of a salt lake, too far from their objectives and too dispersed to have any effect. The southernmost airfield was eventually taken by flying columns arriving from the coast, and a few hours later, 2 squadrons of Spitfires were flown in from Gibraltar. On the following day, the northern airfield was captured by American armored units pushing along the north edge of the Salt Lake, and by nightfall, Oran and its coastal defenses were completely cut off. On the following morning, battleships and cruisers of the task force engaged the seaward defenses, while the infantry and armor cut their way into Oran from the rear. The fighting lasted only a few hours, and by midday the town and its port were in Allied hands. That afternoon, the French North African commander, Admiral Darlan, ordered a general ceasefire, bringing the fighting in Morocco and Algeria to an end. For the Allied commanders, the main priority now was the occupation and consolidation of French Tunisia, and elements of General Anderson's First Army were sent eastwards by land and sea to seize the East Algerian ports of Bougie and Beaune. But the battle for Tunisia was destined to be a long and bitterly fought contest. When reports of the Allied landings had first reached him, Hitler had ordered troops to be scraped together and sent by air transport to take control of the key Tunisian airfields and ports. The first German units arrived on the following day, along with some 40 German combat aircraft. Over the next few days, more would be flown in, and a powerful German bridgehead established in Tunisia. On the 11th, Bougie was taken without resistance, and British and American troops began disembarking. Later that day, however, German aircraft flying from Tunisia swooped down on the transports. The attacks persisted for 3 days, sinking several ships and damaging others, and destroying huge quantities of equipment and supplies. Beaune was taken on the 12th, again without resistance from the French, and forward elements of First Army were probing the Tunisian frontier. But on the same day, the first Axis naval transports arrived in the Tunisian port of Bizerta. Thousands of Germans were now pouring into the country, clearly intending to occupy it as a forward strategic base. By this time, Vichy France itself was under German occupation, and on the 13th, the French garrison forces in Morocco and Algeria were rearmed and placed under Allied command. The withdrawal of Rommel's Panzer Army from the Alamein positions had been undertaken only in the face of its imminent destruction and at the last possible moment. Inevitably, much had been abandoned, including a large part of the Italian infantry, through an acute shortage of transport. But the more mobile German divisions, although considerably depleted, had escaped with at least some of their equipment. From Alamein, these units fell back along the unbroken coastal highway to Fouca, some 50 miles to the west. British pursuit was initially hampered by traffic jams and by the inevitable logistical difficulties of processing large numbers of casualties and prisoners. Axis rear guards deployed on the desert flank compounded these problems, and German air units sought every opportunity to harass and disorganize the British. Clearing up and salvage occupied engineering units that might otherwise have been available for minefield clearance. These still presented problems, not only in the Alamein sector, which in some places was still heavily mined, but also at Fuka, where an old, unmapped minefield held up the pursuit for several vital hours, enabling Rommel to pull back a further 50 miles to Mersa Matruh. From Mersa Matruh, rain and mud hampered any further attempts to cut off the retreating Panzer Army by outflanking movements through the desert, and efficient German demolition teams and rear guards hampered direct pursuit along the coast. On November the 10th, less than a week after the retreat began, the surviving elements of Rommel's army crossed over the Egyptian frontier to Libya. 2 weeks later, they reached the Mersa Brega positions, from where they had set out to conquer Egypt almost a year before. Meanwhile, at the other end of the continent, the follow-up convoys were unloading stores and equipment and disembarking fresh troops. Huge stockpiles were built up to sustain the Allied forces in their drive east. Airfields, roads, and supply depots had to be constructed, often from scratch, and additional rolling stock brought in to augment the dilapidated French railway system. As the runways were laid, hangars erected, and control systems established, more and more aircraft were flown in. But the carefully planned Allied schedule was rapidly being overtaken by events. Although the Allies had pushed small forces into Tunisia within a few days of the landings, they had failed to capture the key strategic ports of Tunis and Bizerta. These were now firmly in German hands, and the French garrison forces disarmed or driven into the mountains. The German build-up in Tunisia threatened to dislocate the Allied strategy of cutting Rommel's lines of supply. Indeed, the ports of Tunisia were much closer to Italy than those of Libya, the sea lanes more secure, and the bridgehead easier to maintain. In December, Allied spearheads that had come to within 10 miles of Tunis were thrown back, consolidating the bridgehead and securing all the major Tunisian ports and harbors under Axis control. December also brought rain, which fell most heavily in the northwest, flooding roads and turning the battlefield into a sea of mud. By Christmas, further advances had become impossible, and a wretched stalemate settled over the front. In December, Rommel abandoned the Mersa Brega positions and began a phased withdrawal to Burat. In mid-January, he fell back again, this time to the Tunisian frontier, evacuating Tripoli en route. 8th Army reached Tripoli on January the 23rd, an advance from Alamein of some 1,400 miles. Although Rommel and the remnants of his force had escaped capture or destruction, Montgomery could take comfort in the fact that he had given the Panzer Army a sound thrashing, destroying more than half of it, and driving the rump in full retreat through Egypt and Libya. In Tunisia, rain and mud continued to hamper operations throughout much of January. This was particularly true in the north, where neither side was able to make any headway. In the south, however, the Germans launched limited attacks to seize key passes in the eastern dorsal. These gave access onto the coastal plain and were only lightly defended, mainly by French North African forces. Lacking effective anti-tank guns, the French were easily overwhelmed, and American efforts to come to their aid were thrown back. The Germans at this time were also active in the air, where they enjoyed several advantages, including all-weather runways and overall air superiority. German efforts were focused on disrupting the Allied build-up, harassing their lines of communication, and damaging or destroying their forward airfields. Air superiority allowed the Germans to employ their Stukas to maximum effect, and swarms of these aircraft raided with impunity in the first months of the campaign. Throughout the battle for Tunisia, Allied efforts on the ground would be continually menaced by these attacks, and huge numbers of their own fighters would be lost in the desperate battle to achieve parity, and eventually dominance in the air. At the end of January, the last key strategic pass in the eastern dorsal fell to 21st Panzer, Rommel's veteran desert formation, which had been hastily re-equipped on its arrival in Tunisia. With the capture of the Faid Pass, the Germans had achieved all of their initial objectives, the consolidation of a powerful bridgehead and the concentration of their forces. They were now in a position to seize the initiative and launch a major offensive of their own. The focus of this effort would be the American Second Corps, holding the most southerly sector of the line. Second Corps was deployed in 3 armored battle groups, holding a discontinuous front. On February the 14th, 21st Panzer advanced out of the south, driving northwest towards Sidi Bouzid. 10th Panzer, meanwhile, which had taken over 21st Panzer's positions in the eastern dorsal, attacked out of the Faid Pass, driving due west. Caught between these pincers, the Americans fell back in confusion, and on the following day began a general withdrawal to the line of the western dorsal, some 50 miles to the rear. On the 15th, the attack was joined by a German battle group consisting of the Afrika Korps' remaining mobile formations. But by the 18th, the American withdrawal was complete, and the danger appeared to be averted. On the 19th, however, after pausing to reorganize and resupply, the Germans resumed their offensive. 21st Panzer advanced towards Biber, while the Afrika Korps Battle Group and 10th Panzer assaulted the pass through the western dorsal at Kasserine. The pass fell early on the 20th, and by the afternoon, German armor and mechanized infantry were pouring through the western dorsal onto the comparatively flat plains beyond. Ahead of them lay 2 key towns, Tala, a vital link in the Allied system of north-south communications, and Tebessa, a major Allied supply dump in eastern Algeria. The speed of the advance was reminiscent of Rommel's early blitzkriegs in Libya and Egypt, and sent a panic through the Allied High Command. If the Afrika Korps and 10th Panzer reached the Algerian frontier and broke through into the rear of the battle zone, they could wreak unimaginable havoc, perhaps even precipitate an Allied collapse. Blocking forces were scraped together from wherever they could be found. Artillery and tanks were rushed to the area, and Allied ground attack aircraft operated around the clock. Savage fighting, confusion and fear characterized these engagements. The Allied blocking forces were ad hoc commands consisting of elements from different units and divisions. Britons, Americans and French fought side by side, commanded by whichever officer happened to be nearest. For their part, the Germans were equally determined to break through and kept up the pressure relentlessly. But they had now advanced for 100 miles, and their supplies of fuel and ammunition were running low. The Allied blocking forces, on the other hand, were fighting only a few miles from their main bases and lines of communication, and were being rapidly resupplied and reinforced. Gradually, the tide of battle began to turn. The Allied lines held, and on the 22nd, the Germans disengaged. Having lost the initiative, Rommel could do little but order a complete withdrawal. The brave gamble had failed, although only just, and the panzer groups would soon be needed to buttress the southern defences against Montgomery's 8th Army. Forward elements of 8th Army had reached the Tunisian frontier in early February, capturing Medellin on the 16th and closing on the Axis defences at Mareth. By mid-March, the army had assembled in strength, and Montgomery's plans and preparations for a drive north were now complete. The key to Rommel's southern defences was the Mareth Line, a complex of interconnecting fortifications built by the French in the 1930s. These ran from the coast near Mareth to the Matmata Hills, through which there were few passes. West of the hills, however, there was open desert leading to the Tabaga Gap and the town of El Hama. Long-range reconnaissance confirmed a route through the desert leading to the gap. Montgomery planned to send the New Zealand Division with attached armour through the desert to assault the gap. While this wide flanking manoeuvre was being carried out, the Mareth Line would be engaged by frontal assaults mounted by 30 Corps, consisting of the 50th Division, the 51st Highland, and the 4th Indian Division. In reserve were the 2 armoured divisions of 10 Corps. These would exploit whichever axis of attack seemed most promising and pursue the retreating forces northwards. Holding the Mareth Line, Rommel had 4 infantry divisions of the Italian First Army, buttressed in the centre by the Afrika Korps veterans of the 90th Light and protected on the flank by those of the 164th Division. Behind these, in tactical reserve, was 15th Panzer. But behind the Mareth Line, Rommel also had a second potential line of defence, before the open plains of central Tunisia. Near Gabes, the impassable salt marshes of the Chott el Fajjaj came to within 20 miles of the coast. If dislodged from the Mareth positions, Rommel planned to withdraw only as far as this line, where 10th and 21st Panzer were held in strategic reserve, ready to deploy in support either of the Mareth Line or of the Gabes positions. Montgomery, however, had requested diversionary attacks to be launched out of the western dorsal by the American Second Corps. By demonstrating towards the coast, Montgomery hoped that Second Corps would draw off the Panzer Reserve. Despite Allied concerns about the combat readiness of Second Corps, the American attack was amongst the most successful of all the preliminary operations. Advancing out of the eastern dorsal, the Americans quickly overcame light opposition, capturing Gafsa and driving some miles down the road leading from Gafsa to the coast. 4 days later, they seized McNassie in the eastern dorsal and pushed out patrols into the surrounding hills. Meanwhile, Montgomery's operations in the south had met with mixed fortunes. The main attack on the Mareth positions had become bogged down in heavy fighting, and a bridgehead, won by the infantry, was counterattacked heavily by 15th Panzer. West of the Matmata Hills, the New Zealanders had stormed the entrance to the Tabaga Gap, but any further exploitation was soon frustrated by the arrival of strong enemy reserves. The Americans southeast of Gafsa were also attacked by 10th Panzer, but 2nd Corps, now commanded by General George Patton, was determined to avenge the humiliations of Kasserine and fought with skill and determination, throwing back 10th Panzer's attack with heavy casualties. Montgomery now switched the focus of his efforts from the Mareth line to the Tabaga Gap, sending 1st Armour to help force a way through. Air support was called in, and the gap was saturated with air and artillery bombardment. In the first phase, tactical bombers added 400 tons to the weight delivered by the artillery. Then ground attack aircraft screamed in from the southwest, 30 of them every 15 minutes, flying almost at head height and shooting up everything that moved. While these operations were in progress, 30 Corps maintained pressure on the Mareth line, holding down 15th Panzer and preventing any further Axis reinforcement of the Tabaga Gap. On March the 27th, the New Zealanders and 1st Armoured, bludgeoning their way forward, were almost clear of the gap. Resistance on 30 Corps' front now diminished significantly as the Axis defenders began falling back towards Gabis. By the 29th, the fighting in the gap and battle for the Mareth line was over, and British armour was driving through El Hamma towards the Gabis line, the last major obstacle before the open plains of central Tunisia. In the west, 2nd Corps' progress had been checked by the arrival of 21st Panzer, but the American attack had now achieved all of its original objectives. The Panzer Reserve had been drawn east at a critical phase in the battle, and then held down in savage fighting, leaving the Axis with no strategic reserve in southern Tunisia. The Gabis positions proved much less formidable than might have been expected, partly because there had not been enough time to prepare them properly. The battle lasted for little more than a day. A breach gouged by 8th Army's infantry in the center of the front was once again plugged by 15th Panzer, but against the withering fire of 8th Army's artillery, there was no hope of holding it closed for long, and there was nothing left in reserve. That night, the battered Axis divisions disengaged and fled to the north. From Gabis, the remnants of the once feared Panzer Army withdrew across the plains of central Tunisia to the comparative safety of the hills surrounding Tunis and Bizerta. Attempts to cut these forces off by attacking through the passes of the eastern dorsal were unsuccessful. but the clearance of central Tunisia gave the Allies important new airfields and radically transformed the balance of air power. From these new forward bases, the Allied air forces were able to mount a systematic offensive against Axis supply ships and against the ports and harbors in the Tunisian bridgehead. In April, the tonnage actually landed in these ports was less than half the required minimum, even for purely defensive operations. By contrast, the Allies had taken advantage of the winter stalemate to build up huge stocks of supplies and equipment, to build roads and airfields, and to amass the necessary men and arms for a decisive victory. The overwhelming material superiority the Allies now enjoyed enabled them to withdraw experienced units and replace them in the line with fresh formations, thus introducing untested soldiers to battle in the most favorable conditions. They also reorganized their command structure and redeployed on a huge scale, bringing up French and American forces for the final offensive, and thus ensuring that the victory honors would be shared equally by all the component nations of the military alliance. Yet despite this pressure and the hopelessness of their situation, the Axis defenders fought stubbornly, bitterly contesting Allied efforts to throw them out of their last mountain redoubts. South of Tunis, they held ideal terrain for defense, a tangle of hills and ravines where the eastern and western dorsal converged. West of Tunis, the line had remained static for months, and the Axis defenses were well organized and difficult to breach. Strong points and commanding heights had to be bludgeoned by artillery and then stormed by infantry. In late April and early May, the Axis bridgehead was hammered remorselessly. Some 16 Allied divisions mounted a series of coordinated offensives, while above them, the Allied air forces bombed, blasted, and strafed, almost with impunity. In early May, the thin Axis crust began to crack, and gaps appeared as the defenders were driven back or pushed aside. On May the 6th, a concerted British effort southwest of Tunis rolled over 15th Panzer, virtually annihilating the veteran desert formation. The breach opened the road to Tunis and threw the Axis defenders into disarray. The last few days of the battle for North Africa saw disorganized and futile fighting in virtually every sector. Tunis fell on the 7th, as did Bizerta, but the fighting continued regardless. Hitler's orders to fight to the last man and the last round ensured that the battle was prolonged unnecessarily, and at the cost of hundreds of lives that might otherwise have been spared. South of Tunis, in the hills above Amphidaville, the remnants of the Afrika Korps held out until the 13th. They were amongst the last to lay down their arms. The final toll of prisoners taken in the closing days of the Tunisian campaign came to nearly 250,000, half of them German. Some of these soldiers had never fired a shot and had only recently arrived from Europe, when the battle for Tunisia was all but lost. Such had been Hitler's determination to hold a bridgehead in Africa. The campaign in North Africa laid the foundations for future Allied successes on the continent of Europe. American soldiers had been tested on the battlefield, and after early setbacks had recovered well and fought bravely. The French North African forces had been brought back into the Allied camp, ending a long period of enforced neutrality and enabling the British and Americans to assume the mantle of liberators rather than of conquerors. A common Allied command structure was established, and the various component armies welded into one homogeneous force. But the greatest single achievement of the campaign was the scale of the victory. 2 entire armies, one German and one Italian, had been utterly destroyed, and the last traces of Axis power and influence had been swept from the continent of Africa. Victory in North Africa also provided the Allies with a springboard for operations against Italy. In July, an Allied invasion of Sicily would quickly lead to the dismissal of Mussolini and efforts by the new Italian government to negotiate an armistice. These efforts were doomed from the outset. In September, Italy was in turn occupied by the Germans and invaded by the Allies. The ensuing battle for Italy would be one of the most protracted and bitterly fought contests of World War II.